fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
Scripture reading today is going to be from Psalm 80. Our teaching discussion will get into mainly Leviticus 25 in the year of Jubilee, but let's lead into that in a moment. First, join me in reading from Psalm 80. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth. Before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up your might and come to save us. Restore us, O God, let your face shine that we may be saved. O Lord, God of hosts, how long will you be angry with your people's prayers? You have fed them with the bread of tears and given them tears to drink in full measure. You make us an object of contention for our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. Restore us, O God of hosts, let your face shine that we may be saved. You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass along the way pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it, and all that move in the field feed on it. Turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stock that your right hand had planted, and for the son whom you made strong for yourself. They have burned it with fire, they have cut it down. May they perish at the rebuke of your face. But let your hand be on the man of your right hand, the Son of Man, whom you have made strong for yourself. Then we shall not turn back from you. Give us life, and we will call upon your name. Restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Let your face shine, that we may be saved. Amen. That's beautiful. So I think feeds in a little bit with what we're going to talk about from Leviticus. Leviticus is really brilliantly structured, and I won't go too deep on this. I talked about it a bit before. And really, I would recommend one of the books I mentioned earlier. There are a lot of academic works on Leviticus that are quite good and point out things like this from the perspective of literary structure and sort of design. But the one that I found the most readable for a layperson and non-academic in its language, although really quite well researched and quite thorough, is Michael Morales's Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord. So I'm drawing a lot on that for the structure stuff, but the structure of Leviticus is really fascinating and brilliant, has a lot of meaning built into it itself. Essentially, in the first 10 chapters, you have prescriptive commands for how to approach the sanctuary. So it is laid out, starting with the offerings and then consecrating the priesthood. It's laid out to tell you how to approach God in his holy space. Then starting in chapter 11 with the dietary laws, through chapter 16 with the Day of Atonement, it becomes about making sure that that holy space where God is and can be approached remains purified, remains free of defilement. And then chapter 16, of course, with the Day of Atonement, is what to do to purge out the defilement, to cause the pollution that has accumulated to be expelled from that sacred space where God's presence is. So most of that section, 11 through 16, will be proscriptive. It'll be watch out for this stuff, keep this out, don't do this, because those things defile. And the goal from chapters 1 through 10 is to approach holy space and God himself. So you have this sense of the first 16 chapters being approaching God in sacred space. And then the maintenance and preservation of that sacred space becomes the overriding sort of, the details are all driving at how to maintain that sacred space so that we can approach God in his sanctuary. What happens then at chapter 17, moving from 17 to 22, is you have what looks like a change in emphasis altogether. We have a lot of laws requiring the people and the priesthood themselves to separate themselves from certain behaviors. They become a lot more ethical in nature. They become focused on maintaining personal holiness and not so much on ritual purity. And that looks like a change in, almost entirely a change in emphasis. It's not. Those chapters are really focused on the people and the land remaining separate from idolatry. Because, and the idea seems to be that to properly sanctify the people and the land is also to protect God's holy space from being defiled. It's just that it moves from the sanctuary as its emphasis and the priesthood in that sacred space, it moves to the land, the wider camp of Israel, which is to say it's an outward movement, but it shows the responsibility for preserving God's sanctuary also has something to do with the people who are not priests and aren't in the sanctuary all the time, doing their part in their daily lives to also avoid bringing the contamination of the idolatrous nations, mainly the practices of the Gentiles, into even the camp of Israel, which could then penetrate into the sanctuary. And so there's this interesting compass, this interesting trajectory movement to the book. And yet when you follow the structure, it's doing a lot of that, but it doesn't move away in space. And then when you get to chapter 23, with what are called in Hebrew the Moedim, the appointed times, the ritual calendar, the festal calendar, there's a shift there, where 23 really is a fulcrum, which pivots things over and talks not about protecting and preserving holy space in the sanctuary, but it starts to discuss and have its emphasis in preserving the sanctity of Israel's calendar. So it is holy time, it's sacred time that's being preserved there, which is a shift away from sacred space, although away from does not mean unrelated to. What happens with this is that the sanctifying of sacred time in chapter 23 to the end of the book is meant to make the same point that's made before that in the first half of the book about sacred space. There are two things, actually there are three, but we're not going to get too deep into the third. There are two primary things we're talking about here in Leviticus that the people are meant to sanctify with their lives and their ritual worship and their both individually and corporately, their focus should be on the sanctifying of the sanctuary, keeping the sanctuary holy and keeping it free from defilement. So that's an emphasis on sacred space. And then the second is sanctifying holy time. Sacred time becomes an emphasis as well. And the main door that enters into that discussion is the Sabbath. So Leviticus 26, verse 2, actually makes a statement that kind of just summarizes this. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So again, in the context of avoiding idolatry and maintaining proper worship, two things here, the Sabbath and the sanctuary, are treated as of equal value. They are both two things that function as one type of thing that Israel is to protect because they belong to Yahweh. What you have essentially with this formulation and just the logic of the whole system is that the Sabbath is to time what the sanctuary is to space. This is something, I think it's Abraham Joshua Heschel who wrote years ago, that the Sabbath is something like a cathedral in time. What we think of the sanctuary as being in holy space, you think of the Sabbath, and that is the same thing. It's a sanctuary you can go to, not at a place, but in a time. But essentially they serve the same purpose. So the appointed times that begin in chapter 23, starting with, interestingly, the Sabbath, are ways that highlight how in ritual time God can be engaged and his people can sort of grow in holiness as they worship him. So the observance of the calendar really starts to become important toward the latter end of the book. The Sabbath is the sign of the covenant for Israel. Their engagement with God on the Sabbath, week to week, is a covenant renewal ceremony of sorts every week. So what happened on Mount Sinai, when he implemented the covenant with them, and in fact the Sabbath covenant has some ties all the way back to creation. You have a 6-day creation week, and then the 7th day is God resting, and he's giving humanity sort of an enthronement motif there. He's constructed his temple, he's entered into his rest, which is his ruling on his throne, and now his image, mankind, will begin to rule with him in this state of an ordered peace, a universe that is whole, that is complete. That's what the word for 7 and week and Sabbath, they're all connected. Shavah is a completeness. The completeness has been accomplished. It's brought order to the cosmos, and now mankind will rule with God in a sort of eternal Sabbath. That's the picture that's going on there in Genesis. So that picture becomes ritually replayed in microcosm in the Moedim, in the appointed times, and certainly every week on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. That brings to Leviticus 24, which really, when you're reading through Leviticus, you read through the festivals of chapter 23, then you get to chapter 24, and it's a bizarre-looking chapter to be located where it is. It starts with the Lord commanding Moses to tell the people to bring the pure olive oil to maintain the lamps, the burning fire of the 7-branched menorah in the sanctuary. It was always to be kept burning, but it was the people's responsibility to bring the oil for the priest to maintain the menorah, and then also to maintain the 12 loaves that stand on the table of what's called the table of showbread across from the menorah. So there's just this seemingly strange insertion of, after the festivals are detailed in chapter 23, here is instructions about maintaining the lampstand, keeping the fire burning on the menorah, and maintaining the loaves of bread on the table before the presence of God. And it seems like a bit of a strange insertion. And then it gives way to a really bizarre encounter where there's an actual narrative dropped in there. This Israelite man who has an Egyptian father, who then blasphemes the name of Yahweh and is taken out and executed. It's a bizarre story dropped in the middle of otherwise ritual procedures for observing the holidays, and then this focus on the lampstand and the showbread. And it's quite a discussion to get into what all that means and what it's doing there. So we won't get into that. But the picture of the menorah constantly burning in the sanctuary, and it's shining light over onto the what's called the bread of the presence. Literally, there you can read that as the bread that is before God's face. I think that actually is helpful to think about it in those ways. Showbread doesn't really do the work that the Hebrew is doing there. It's the bread that is before God's face. It's the bread of his presence, the bread that he is actually looking at, if you just read it quite literally. Anyway, that happens. The priest would go in there with the lamp, the fire of the menorah, shining light over on the table of the bread of the presence, and they would have to, every Sabbath, restore fresh bread to the table. And then they would take the bread that's been sitting there. That would become food for them. And this whole thing is treated like a sort of ritual enactment of Sabbath worship. And the whole scene is sort of symbolically playing out, again in microcosm, a sort of creation ritual. A restoration and renewal of creation is going on there. Each Shabbat, the priests are sustained by the bread that was previously put there, but they need the light of the menorah to shine on their work there, to shine down on the presence. The table is something like the earth in Genesis, which sprouts forth food. That's kind of the idea of the ritual symbolism there. The menorah has lights shining, and they're up elevated. So these lights are shining down to maintain, as in Genesis, the lights were given for times and seasons, for Moedim. They were the lights by which we fix and practice and observe the appointed times. So throughout the weekly Sabbath replacement of the bread, there's a sort of picture where God's light, God's literally his face, is shining down on Israel, which are represented by these 12 loaves of bread. 12 is the number of the tribes of Israel. And they are the fruit of the earth. It's sort of restored every week. There's a picture there that's actually quite powerful and profound. The menorah shines God's light on Israel. It is his creation light being shone down, and then there is this constant renewal happening, and it happens according to the weekly Shabbat ritual. And so there's this whole blending together of themes from Genesis. But the priests would also, in Numbers 6, the priests are also given a benediction to place upon God's people, to say to God's people. So Aaron's blessing in Numbers 6:22 also seems to provide a verbal picture of what that ritual is doing with the menorah and the showbread. Verse 22, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. There's this sort of picture in the verbal expression of Aaron and his sons upon the people that actually replays what takes place each Shabbat in the sanctuary, where the face of Yahweh is made to shine on the people, and that expression provides this renewal. It reemphasizes this theme of rest and blessing and abundance. So it's all quite fascinating. Again, a lot more we could do with this, but I just wanted to lay the framework, because when you see the structure of Leviticus, now it's pieced together. It is actually got a logic to it that's building up to something. It's not just random laws thrown in and then a narrative story about a blasphemer here, and then it works actually quite coherently, but you have to know what it's doing, which is to say it's painting a ritual picture of new creation, of life from the dead. It's highlighting themes of creation, and this Sabbath in particular is going to become the focus toward the tail end of the book, and that is certainly where we're going in Leviticus 25. Actually, it starts with what we call the Shemitah. It's a 7-year rest for the land. So just like every week, you have a 6-day cycle and then a 7-day rest for the people. Every 6 years, there was to be announced on the 7th year a Shabbat for the land. So the land would receive a rest. And again, this is just sort of an extension of God's covenant, right? Which is the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant for Israel. His covenant actually also extends to the land. That's important. A lot of people have a lot of ideas about what should be happening in the land of Israel and what is going to happen there. That is God's land. He will do with it what he wants, because by covenant, the land is also included in his blessings. This is partly why, and this comes up later in Leviticus 26, is partly why when the people fail to observe the 7-year rest for the land, God will get that back. The way he'll do that is by exiling them from the land, so that all those years they're gone, the land will be enjoying its Sabbaths. It will receive its rest, despite their unfaithfulness to give it the rest that God required, because it's his land, and one way or another, his covenant will provide for his land, just as his covenant will always provide for his people. Beautiful picture there. We don't quite know always what to make of the Shemitah, because we think, well, what's the big deal about the land here? Actually, it's quite important, both for what it symbolizes, but also because there's a connection between the land and the people that can't quite be severed. So that's important to keep in mind. It's probably worth noting, although I won't get into this, it goes back a few years now, but I'm sure it's not quite out of the realm of a lot of people's understanding yet. You had, especially with Jonathan Cahn's book a few years back about the Shemitah, there was this whole effort. Jonathan Cahn's a Messianic rabbi in New York who tried to connect the Shemitah yearly Sabbath, the 7-year Sabbath rest of the land of Israel in Leviticus, to the American economy and the stock market. And there was all this sort of way too clever by half calculations for how what's really going on in America is God is implementing the Shemitah as like a prophetic sign, and all this means, I guess the return of the Lord is coming soon, and the rapture is going to happen. That stuff, just to put it tersely and be done with it, is basically nonsense from start to finish. It is certainly not what Leviticus is talking about. This is particular to Israel and the covenant people and the land. And if it has anything whatsoever to do with America, it is not at all connected in the way that he said it was. So that work was quite something to sort through at the time. To the extent that it holds any particular sway in your imagination to this day, I would suggest just don't pay attention to it. That is not what Leviticus is doing. And that stuff really starts to confuse people and lose actually a lot of the meaning of what Leviticus is actually there to teach us. So in any case, let's move on from there. All this serves a purpose to build us up to the Jubilee year. The main thing to focus on there is just the concentration, the sort of repetition and saturation of the language of sevens. This Sabbath theme by the repetition of sevens. Once you hit chapter 23 of Leviticus, the grammar just spikes. The use of some variation on the term for 7 just absolutely skyrockets, and it saturates the rest of the book. A Shavah is 7. It's a week. It's a complete cycle. These are all connected grammatically in Hebrew. All this language of sevens highlights the theology, the theological themes of completion, security, rest, and it's all meant to bring God's covenant to the foreground. All this is marked by Shabbat, by a cycle of 7 in some sense. So when you hit chapter 23 of Leviticus, this all starts to really build momentum. Throughout chapter 23, there are 7 appointed times. There are 7 particular days of rest within that yearly cycle of appointed times. 7 of the days are specifically called to be Sabbaths. The festivals of unleavened bread and booths are both 7-day long festivals. The time between Passover and the Feast of Weeks, what we call Pentecost, is a period of 7 weeks that you count off from one holiday to the next. So there's this whole period of 7s counted up till you get to the 49th. And then Pentecost, the reason it's called Pentecost is that means 50. So on the 50th is Feast of Weeks. In the 7th month of the ritual calendar, you have 3 of the festivals, one of which is a 7-day festival. Then, beginning in chapter 25, you have the 7-year Sabbath, the Shemitah. 7 years and the land will rest. All of that finally gets you to you have 7 Sabbaths of years, 49 years go by, so weeks of years counted up in periods of 7, and you get to the 50th, which is then proclaimed a Jubilee, the Yovel. All this is meant to really build on this idea of just sevens flying at you everywhere. That's all signaling. That's all telling you something is coming and something is to be learned from that. So when you get to the Jubilee, by use of this concentration and repetition of the idea of sevens everywhere, just this big Sabbath theme, what you basically have is the Jubilee is meant to function like one ultimate, massive, highest possible expression of Sabbath. It's this sort of ultimate Sabbath rest that's going to be implemented. The Jubilee is a fascinating piece of social legislation. It's really quite sophisticated. It's got a lot of different nuances to it. If we sat down and had the time and go through all the details, really quite remarkable in what it's doing there. That was not our focus today. We've gone through some of that in the commentary throughout the week, and it's better done in more arcane discussions. Than we don't want to get bogged down in the weeds here today, but it really would have been a revolutionary piece of legislation. It picks up on some of the ways that ancient societies would have worked, but it radically alters things in a way that would make God's people in their land under his covenant quite distinct from the way any other society worked. It's, as I just mentioned with the Shemitah, it doesn't work to try to take Jubilee legislation and bring it straight across and say, well, if we just did this in Western democracies, if America would just operate on this principle, then our government would cease to have all these problems, and we would have these, we'd have a poverty program, an anti-poverty program, and social justice would be implemented in the land. Like, that doesn't really work as a one-to-one comparison, as a program for government social justice legislation. It really doesn't work that way, just like taking the Shemitah year and then trying to apply it prophetically to America doesn't work. It's got a more particular application to the ancient Israelites in their holy land. That's what it's designed primarily to deal with. So I don't want to misrepresent what's going on here. And you do have there's a long history of people taking the Jubilee year in particular and trying to build social programs out of it. That can be really quite misguided, because you end up with something like a justification from Leviticus 25 that people will see for something like a quasi-Marxist or socialist social program because of the care for the poor that's really provided for in Leviticus 25. That doesn't work, again, as a one-to-one, straight across. We'll just take this and we'll implement it in the government program. Doesn't quite work that way. So I would caution against reading it that way and trying to make it work that way. Just as I would say, don't take things like the Shemitah and try to jam them into a prophetic timeline and say, this is what America, this is the message God's giving America. Like, none of this really works that way. So we need to handle it more responsibly than that. But what is happening with the Jubilee and a lot of this stuff, where it applies to the land and the people of ancient Israel, there is a good deal of teaching there that we can learn from. What it's teaching us is values. What it's teaching us is theology. Not necessarily prophecy. It may have some prophetic implications. Not necessarily government policy, like political programs. It would be good to take Leviticus before you implement a government program and try to learn some of the principles. That's fine. But what it is doing is it is signaling for us and setting us on a trajectory that if you take the values seriously, if you take the messaging seriously and try to implement it and sort of internalize it, both in terms of worship and in community, it's really powerful if you look at it that way. What it meant for ancient Israel, it doesn't exactly mean for us in terms of we are not a theocratic nation living under this covenant, But that is not to say that the theology and the symbolism and the values that it teaches shouldn't be stuff we can deeply embed into our lives and learn from. So I'm going to focus on that here just to close us off today. There's a whole lot we could go through. Part of what's happening is what the Day of Atonement does in chapter 16 for the sanctuary, which is to say it's a ritual that purges out defilement, it purges the pollution out of the sanctuary. The Jubilee year is accomplishing something similar. In fact, it takes place. The Yovel is pronounced, it's proclaimed on the Day of Atonement of the 49th year. It's going to be the culmination where this Day of Atonement is going to be like an ultimate atonement, where the annual Day of Atonement purifies the sanctuary from ritual contamination. The Yovel, the Jubilee Day of Atonement, it's going to take that annual sanctuary purification and it's going to turn it into an ultimate purification where the whole land and the people will be sort of restored to a social equilibrium. So things are balanced out, wiped clean, if you will. So the way the people's ritual defilement would contaminate the sanctuary, leading to the need for a Day of Atonement once a year, their social interactions with each other, which would include injustices and oppression and people having to sell themselves into service and sell their land for the use of another just to survive. All that contributes a sort of, it puts the whole nation out of balance, throws things out of whack. So the Day of Atonement on the year of Jubilee is going to wipe that all out the way ritual impurity gets wiped out on the Day of Atonement, and it's going to restore a sort of balance to the land, to the people, to the land, and everything just sort of, harmonizes once again with this big giant reset button. So it's really quite profound, the implications there. That's a way of, again, setting a trajectory, building in legislation that would teach people that just as the land can be defiled, just as the sanctuary can be defiled by bodily defilements and by certain of your behaviors, the land and the people can be defiled, in a sense, by how you treat each other in a socioeconomic system. It's not a ritual focus anymore, it's an ethical one, but it's doing the same thing. It's showing that this is all Yahweh's, and since it's His, since He owns it all, it must be maintained properly. The way in the social world of Leviticus you maintain that is through loving your neighbor as yourself, treating your brother not as a slave, but as a fellow servant. He also belongs to Yahweh, so how you treat him is going to really matter, even if he's forced to temporarily serve you since he's come into hardship. It's really brilliant, and the values that come out of that are quite profound. So it protects the land, the sanctuary, and the people, all because they belong to Yahweh. They're His. This cuts against the usual association of Leviticus as a bunch of strict rules that are set up so that you make sure you worship properly, because if you don't worship properly, well, God will be mad at you. It's not really doing that. It actually cuts against that in some ways. There are similar release of debts in the ancient world. Israel's neighbors, their pagan neighbors, would have opportunities where debts could be released, and it would function similar to the way the Jubilee here functions. But what's important there is the distinction. In those cultures, it was the king who had the right to decree debts forgiven. It's not that what happens in Leviticus 25 didn't happen in other societies. It was that the king was considered the owner of the land in those societies. And you could possibly have your debts forgiven. If you fell into hardship like this, you could have the balance restored, and you could be reset onto the land and start over. Possible. But you have to be connected to the king, or you'd have to already be a person of some status or note. You'd have to have the right connections. And then it would all be left to the king's whim. If he felt like it, he could do it. He owns the land, you serve him. In a sense, you belong to him. So you're just sort of waiting around hoping that maybe the king will act benevolently toward us, and then maybe we'll get restored. And it's really this fear-based not quite hopeful system that, yeah, maybe, but who knows? You got to get the right connections. It's politics. The Jubilee year of Leviticus upends all that. It overlays on that type of system, but it also is a polemic against it. In this system, Yahweh is the king. He's the owner of the land. He's king over the people. He rules in his power, but he provides in his kindness freedom and restoration according to a fixed order. Not when he feels like it, not when he just decides to because somebody has done a favor for him. He provides a fixed system, an orderly system that says you can count on the benevolence of this landowner. You can count on the king to act thus according to a set prescribed order. Imagine if you're in this system and you're not well connected or you're not wealthy. You're a person of humble means, but you've also fallen on hard times. If your only hope is maybe maybe a new king will come to the throne, and when he does, maybe he'll be predisposed to just do us all a favor, your life would be lived in terrible oppression. Hopeful would be the last thing you would be in that situation. But if you're an Israelite and you're in that condition, you've got an automatic built-in hope because the king has already announced his benevolence. He's already given you this kindness that would be enacted. So it's a really beautiful piece of not just social legislation, but it's a wonderful teaching tool to learn something about theology. This teaches us something about God and how his covenant works. He has his love, his care for the land and the people has this unifying and democratizing effect. It shines on everybody, right? Remember the lampstand, the menorah in the sanctuary. Remember the bread represents Israel. His grace shines out on the whole nation, on all the people. It is not dependent on status, class. It's not dependent on favors. It's not dependent on being well connected. It's just, this is how his covenant works because this is the kind of God we serve. It's really profound and quite beautiful. Leviticus 25 contains one of the great quotes about freedom. It's actually inscribed on the Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty to the captives. That quote from the Liberty Bell is taken from Leviticus. It's a sort of ultimate expression of freedom. I said before, Leviticus is a book not just of ritual worship and procedures. It's a book of values. It's a book of theology. And that expression found probably its culmination here in Leviticus 25 in the Jubilee year. The ritual symbols have importance throughout the book, but they're important because they teach us something about God's character. And there may be, among the things that you need to know about God's character is how he feels about freedom. God's view of liberty is essential for his people to understand and to engage with. Leviticus is a book not about rule keeping to get God's favor. It's a book that teaches how to live in the freedom that he wants us to have. The people didn't own anything, or they didn't own the land. They had material possessions, but they didn't own the land. Other people couldn't own God's people. They belonged to him. The whole declaration of freedom, the whole emphasis of liberty in the Jubilee year helps us understand just how deeply God cares about freedom, but it also gives us a deeper understanding of how we as God's people ought to think about freedom. Freedom in God's economy. Freedom does not mean you now have the ability to do whatever you want. God's freedom for his people is not about self-mastery, it's not about autonomy, and it's certainly not about individualism. I am free from that dude, now I can do what I feel like. That is not the picture of freedom in Leviticus or frankly anywhere else in the Bible. The Jubilee freedom is moving from one master, one would-be master, under the domain of another. The only thing you have to decide is, who will I be a servant to? Will I serve this guy to whom I have mortgaged myself, to whom I've sold myself? out of necessity? Or will I serve Yahweh? Will I serve the Lord because he's my right and proper owner? But in either case, you are not free to just behave however you want. Freedom is not liberation from any responsibility. Freedom is free. I am now liberated so that I may serve my true master, who is the king. In a time where we are all hearing a lot about the erosion of our freedoms, I think we ought to take this a little bit more seriously and think more deeply about what the Bible actually means by freedom. If you think, being a Christian, that it is a biblical value that we should live free, and therefore you're getting exercised about the infringement of your freedoms because, say, I don't know, let's take some examples from the news. I'm not free to walk into a store, which is private property, who requests that or requires that I have to wear a mask when I go in there to keep other people safe. If that's your view of an infringement upon freedom, you're probably not understanding what the Bible means by freedom. You're free to serve Jesus as a believer. You're free so that you can belong to him and therefore serve him in that liberty. If you think that, well, I should be able to carry my rifle in a mass protest, walking around brandishing a loaded rifle because I'm worried that my freedoms are being assaulted by a government official, I'm going to suggest that is not what the Bible means by what we're supposed to be doing with our freedom. I'm not talking about legal freedoms here. Are you legally free? Well, you're not free to enter private property. If they have restrictions on the private property, you actually don't have that freedom. But are you free to carry a rifle in some states and just walk around with it? Sure, I'm not against that. You come to our church any Sunday, trust me, there are plenty of people armed. We live in Arizona, man. You have that legal right. You are free to carry weapons, even in some states, to open carry weapons. Fine. I don't challenge the legal freedom to do that. My point is, as Christians, we ought to think about what the Bible means by freedom. When it says it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. We walk in the liberty that Christ has given to us. I'm suggesting that means something much deeper than that because we have the legal right to do this. We're allowed to do it. Therefore, we ought to be able to do it. And if you suggest that we shouldn't do it, we're going to yell and protest about how important our freedoms are. I'm suggesting that for a believer, that is to misconstrue what the Bible means by giving us this tremendous freedom that's being proclaimed here with the Jubilee. The Jubilee is about setting the captives at liberty. Jesus' mission was one of a Jubilee-style liberation, right? Luke 4, he goes into the synagogue. He reads from Isaiah 61 about setting the captives at liberty. That is a direct reference to Leviticus 25. He is a Jubilee Messiah. He is here to proclaim liberty, set captives free. It is a restoration. With that restoration comes freedom for those who will participate in his kingdom. It's a profound freedom that he is coming to bring people. It is more profound to think that we're set free so that we can serve him. Exclusive devotion to the Lord, not to anyone else. We don't belong to them. That's true. But as we serve him, his calling is to consider how can we witness to and serve and love other people. And if your concern about your own personal ability to do what you want means you are putting yourself at odds with those to whom we're supposed to witness, I'm suggesting our freedoms are askew. We've not understand the biblical freedom to come under the service of our true master, and instead we're worried too much about who's trying to be our master. They don't have any right to us, right? They're not actually able to do that much to us. If they use legal authorities, if they use illegal abuses of authority to infringe upon our freedoms, to do as we wish, to live as we want. We still have to put that as subservient to our true liberty to do as God wants us to do. And if what he's called us to do is to love our neighbor, to care for our brother, to bear his image before the unbelieving world, then that's the liberty we should be preoccupied with. That's the Jubilee liberty, to set people free. Christians are set free, not to some abstract notion of being able to do whatever we want because we have the individual liberty to do that, but set free so that we can serve Yahweh wisely and as his witnesses, that we can bear his name before an unbelieving world in such a way that they would see, and that's the kind of freedom we want. We want freedom in Christ, to be set free from sin, to be set free from death, to be set free from the fear of these things. And if that is not enough to launch us full speed into that pursuit of freedom, and instead we want to hang around down here with trivial ideas about, well, I really hope my freedom to go where I want, wear what I want, brandish firearms as I feel I want to. We are just choosing the wrong field of freedom. I'm not saying those as a legal matter, as a policy matter, that there aren't real issues there. I'm saying they are small issues stacked up against what the Bible is actually talking about with the Jubilee year and God's perspective on setting people free. So as believers, I think we have a responsibility, a duty to actually take this concept of freedom seriously. But part of taking it seriously means not settling for lesser freedoms as our main emphasis, the thing we're most concerned with, these little erosions of freedom as we see it, our individual autonomy. I realize that stuff's annoying. At this point, that's all it is. It's not, very few people have really been impacted in the body of Christ in America or in the West. There are real erosion of religious freedoms in, say, China, in places in the Far East, in India, where Christians really are persecuted. Their freedoms really are curtailed by threat of violence, government power. We tend to be spoiled in how we think of these things. And I'm suggesting here, if we take the biblical view of freedom, which is what the Jubilee year is about, if we take that and really try to embody it, really take the lessons here, I think we'll come away with something much more profound than to get caught up on smaller problems of society. Part of that is a function of what we call first world problems. We don't know oppression well enough. We're not acquainted with real erosions of freedom. And so we pick small erosions of freedom and we blow them up, we amplify them out of proportion. Not that they're not real, not that I'm a big fan of eroding freedoms. I'm a freedom guy. But I think we have to see it according to the bigger picture of the Bible. And then we realize, the early Christians were not running around petitioning governments for things like this. They certainly weren't participating in mass protests about issues like this. Often their freedoms were actually removed, forcibly removed. Paul's thrown in jail times without number. Peter thrown in jail. Peter and John brought up before essentially religious bureaucrats who imposed an injustice on them every chance they got. Their response was not to assert some sort of individual autonomy, that they had the freedom to say these things and so therefore they would, that they could go wherever they want and say whatever they wanted. No, their appeal was, we will do what God calls us to do, and if you take our freedoms, we'll submit to that, and we'll still do what God calls us to do. So we need to think these things through a little bit more. But the Jubilee is one of these ultimate expressions of God's value and his character. He values freedom. He values rest. He values an ordered system. He values people. so much that he would send his son to be the ultimate Jubilee bringer. Through his death, he sets captives free, and that brings this ultimate Sabbath rest for anyone who is now in that covenant relationship. And man, does it become a profound thing to think about. So profound that my suggestion is we don't settle for taking ideas so powerful as freedom and making such little fights out of them. There's a bigger system at work here, and it's much more profound and beautiful than anything I think we could go pick a fight. There are fights everywhere. We always have these fights. What the Bible's doing with this, what the Jubilee year teaches us, is so penetrating and deep and expansive that I just think we ought to rethink how we approach what essentially are little offshoots in relation to the biblical story, not that we shouldn't have anything to do with those things, but that they cannot become what defines us as a people of God. So we'll leave it at that. I hope the Jubilee has some resonance for you beyond just the social legislation. And if you dig into it, read more about it, and just think about these things and how deep the signals really go. I hope that will provide not just some insight, but really some cause for reflection and some help to get us through what is a bizarre and confusing time. The principles are really here. I think there's a lot for us to work with here and to chew on. But don't be satisfied with saying something so profound as what the Jubilee year is doing is so that I can be set free from this small inconvenience. I think that sells it short. So interesting to be reading through this at a time of such social disruption and upheaval and mass inequality. Leviticus deals with all this. The Jubilee year certainly deals with it all. So there you go. I hope that at least gives you something to think about. And until then, in keeping with the picture of the lampstand and the covenant renewal ceremony of each Sabbath and that blessing from Numbers 6 that I referenced earlier, we'll recite it once again as a closing benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom.